Welcome to TheoCon, where theology meets pop culture, where faith meets fiction, where the sacred meets the secular, and where Harry met Sally. I'm joking. Harry didn't meet Sally here at all. So stay tuned for more of my corny jokes.
It could happen.
But what's that?
It could happen. You might be a prophet and predicting something
You
that's
know, we
going to
we
happen.
provide pretty good space for people to
We do.
meet. So,
We do.
yeah. Thank you. So again, my name is Shayna Watson, and I'm here with my amazing team, Brian and Maddie Brake, Missy Whitus, Will Rose, and our special guest today, Tahina. We are so thankful to have you on board with us. So today's topic, the Odd I See, or TheOddISee, Pandemic Apocalyptic Literature and the Holy. We could probably easily rename it to Pandemic Protests and the Holy. So the Odd I See plays on the word theodicy, which is the search for a good God in the midst of the context of evil. Theodicy is a literal translation of, obviously, the Odd I See. It's also the theological exploration or approach to the strange, unusual, and remarkable occurrences and connections between language around the apocalypse and what we see in comics and film and in the world today. And so it's also a play on TheoCon. So we're going to enter into a segment called Theo Conversation, which Missy Whitus came up with. Thank you, Missy. This is such a great title for a segment, Theo Conversation. So we're going to begin just with our guests, maybe sharing just for 2 or 3 minutes some of your work, or naming something that you'd like to share with the audience, that you'd like the audience to know about you, and also maybe your thoughts on the title.
Sure. Hello, my name is Tuhina Verma Rash. I am ordained in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America as a minister of Word and Sacrament. But I currently serve as a minister of small groups at University AME Zion Church in Palo Alto, California. And thinking about what would I want people to know about me in the midst of this conversation. I write a lot and I talk a lot about the variety of identities that we all carry, that we're not just one sole thing, that we are a multitude. And part of that is also like the amalgamation of identities that I hold. And something that actually really fascinates me, that a lot of people don't actually know about me, that I'm really excited to share about today, is really my love of science fiction. And also the relationship of like the Romero zombie movies and how that actually relates to theological discussion. Because George Romero, when he made Night of the Living Dead, I think he made it at such a critical time in history. And one of the things that I'm also really learning about history through reading Adrienne Marie Brown's Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds, and looking through like Octavia Butler's writings in science fiction with the parables, is that history does repeat itself, but it doesn't repeat itself exactly. It repeats itself as a spiral. And so we actually, every time that we touch on the spiral, we actually grow out. And so there is learning and experience that comes with us as we grow out in the spiral. And so thinking today about Romero's 1968 Night of the Living Dead and how that actually is a touch point in today, and how we are looking at the uprisings after the deaths of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, of Ahmaud Arbery, and what actually like zombies and pop culture can actually inform our theology, and actually how we even talk about social justice and change in this current time.
That was amazing. I feel like I can rest now. I'm so glad. I'm like, you said all the things in just those 2 or 3 minutes that you talked, all the things that, you know, that that I love, and I know many of us enjoy and appreciate talking about. As a matter of fact, this very show was created with you in mind after we met during the Triduum project that was Church of the Geek was a part of, with Brian Bennett, and Will Rose was there. And when we met you, you started talking about zombies, and we're like, oh my goodness, we've been trying to find a way to do some type of TheoCon conversation around zombies for like ever. I think we did an attempt around Halloween. We try to integrate it even during the resurrection conversation. We're like, how can we talk about zombies? Like, we want to talk about Jesus, but we're more interested in Night of the Living Dead. Like, how do we bring it together? And like you created that for us. So I'm going to invite the team just to unmute themselves. And if anyone wants to jump in on the conversation, this is a great time to do so. If you can share a little bit more, Tahina, for some of us who might not be as familiar with the zombie genre, and and how you are making that zombie resurrection reanimation connection.
So I think part of it is that realizing that zombies actually really come from voodoo culture and from Black culture, and how I think part of that has actually been absconded, and actually kind of like thinking about 1930s Hollywood, and how 1930s Hollywood had actually taken kind of like the rituals of zombie culture and voodoo culture and had actually really malformed it, and had actually taken it in a way to kind of like produce it as like this really, like, it wasn't really the form of like what voodoo wanted or what voodoo like was really created to be, but it was like white Hollywood taking it to actually have like a dark villain. In which like the helpless white woman needed to be saved. And so I think like that was the initial introduction of zombies into Hollywood and into like really like mainstreaming pop culture. And so the realization of like, you know, it has really racialized beginnings, like so much. Am I allowed to swear?
I say if you can keep it PG-13.
Oh, okay. So that means I'm allowed to drop one F-bomb. Cool. Okay.
Brian will beep it out in the
We
editing.
didn't even talk about it before the show
Yeah,
started.
so like normally that's like the question I have to ask before things begin, but then things kind of like got away from me, and then it's like, oh, because
holy swearing.
right, yeah.
Oh,
Look, it is a protest to God. I'm just saying. Anyway, so let me get back to where I was. And so when George Romero was making Night of the Flesh Eaters in 1967, 1968, it was really kind of like thinking about like Night of the Flesh Eaters. And unfortunately, when he tried to copyright the film, that copyright was already taken. And so he renamed the film Night of the Living Dead, but forgot to copyright it, which is how it ended up on PBS when I was 6 years old. Anyway, that's another story for later on in this interview.
Did not know that.
Yeah. So that's actually how they could show it on PBS, was because they didn't actually have to pay the copyrights to air it on PBS because it was technically within free domain. So what George Romero had done with Night of the Living Dead was that he had taken the cast of characters, but the protagonist, like pretty much the person who was responsible for like getting this collective group together and looking out for their survival for one another, was a strong Black man. And that the rest of the characters were white, and that either they were with Ben, the Black man in the movie, who was like the strong lead character, And so it was Ben who was like trying to organize, Ben who was trying to communicate, Ben who was trying to fortify the house to make sure that everybody was safe. But in the midst of it, there was a breakdown of communication. And so this is where actually my Lutheran theology comes in corvatus in se, the heart turned inward on itself. And so if you're actually looking out for your own needs and your own interests, you forget about the needs and the interest of your neighbor who's created in God's image. And so the minute that in corvatus in se starts taking place in each of the characters, you can actually kind of see everything start to disintegrate. And so the ultimate disintegration at the end is where Ben, who has locked himself in the basement after the community that he was trying to form had either all died or become zombies, when the night was over, Ben came up from the basement, and this is the most disturbing part of Night of the Living Dead. You would think it would be the zombies, right, that are coming to like break into the home. The most disturbing part of George Romero's movie is the white lynch mob who's outside, and they shoot Ben and they hang him from a tree, even though Ben was not a zombie. And so to have that movie come out in the northeastern United States in 1968 communicates a very strong message about the racialized state of where the United States is in 1968, and where actually we find ourselves to be in present day in 2020. I mean, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And then we move to 1978, Dawn of the Dead. And so the other really bonkers thing about the 1978 version of Dawn of the Dead is that there are multiple versions of this movie. So there's the theatrical release, there is the uncut version, and then there's also the Dario Argento version. So Dario Argento, who had made the zombie movies in Italy, had also done a cut of Romero's 78 version of Night of the Living Dead. And so what happens, so like there's like Romero takes a lot of like what systemic oppressions are happening within the United States, and he actually depicts this in his zombie movies. And so when we see 1978 Dawn of the Dead, we see the racialized aspects of what's happening in the United States. So this movie is also taking place in, I believe it's Pittsburgh. I can't remember off the top of my head because there's also been so many remakes. And seriously, y'all, do not bother remakes.
Oh my goodness. I'm sorry, Tahina. There were a couple of questions on the floor for you during the beginning of your speech, and if it's okay with you, I'm going to invite Maddie and Will to comment or question. Matt?
So, Tahina, I had two questions because you said two things that really stuck out to me. I'd love to hear expounded on more.
Okay.
One was I'd love to hear about the place of the zombie in original voodoo thought. And then a little bit more about maybe laid out a little more explicitly the racial component of zombies, because I can definitely see this maybe like it's hinted at, and there are certainly analogies being drawn between the use of zombies, the whitewashing of zombies, the use of zombies to talk about systemic racism. But can you say a little bit more about the original idea of the zombie, and then a little bit more explicitly about what zombies have come to sort of represent in consciousness in terms of their depictions and how they're used?
So I'm actually going to be really super honest, and I can't answer the first part of that question. Like, I don't actually really have the knowledge base to speak the way that I want to about zombies and voodoo within the voodoo traditions. And so I don't want to talk about things I don't know. And particularly when they do actually have cultural relevance in this present day as well. So I am afraid I cannot answer the first part of the question.
No problem. So the second part then, the explicit use, like I'm getting the idea that there is sort of some language of the invasive flesh-eating monster and there being some racial component to that, but could you break that down a little more about what that's come to symbolize?
So I actually think part of it is a racial component, but I think it's like when we get to the 1978 version of Dawn of the Dead, we get to the capitalist component. And then when we get to Dawn of the Dead, no, Day of the Dead, sorry, we get to the militarized component. And so there's actually different forms of oppression that Romero looks at through who's actually alive in the midst of all of this. And so when we see the racialized component in Night of the Living Dead, it's the question of, you know, who's actually living, who's actually like who's actually participating in like having an active role of engagement. And so when we get to Dawn, it's the capitalist component. And, you know, I did actually poo-poo on like the remakes, but when we get to actually Tom Savini's 1990 remake of Night of the Living Dead, the story changed, the end of the story changed. So instead of Ben surviving, Barbara survived. And if you've seen the 1968 version of Night of the Living Dead and realized, oh shit, spoiler, shit. Okay.
Shit, damn it. Damn, I mean, damn it to hell. Ah.
Gosh darn it to heck. Son of a biscuit. When we realize that Barbara has actually survived, spoiler alert, in the 1990 Tom Savini directed version of Night of the Living Dead, yeah, I did poo-poo the remake. And I think there's something really compelling about the end of Tom Savini's remake, where Barbara is like, you know, armed to the teeth, like, you know, she's like a white woman bearing guns. It's like my nightmare of Karen.
Girl.
Yeah, the full-on Karen nightmare of like armed white woman coming for you. It's like, oh.
Oh.
But Barbara sees like they're starting, like the mob, the white lynch mob, they're starting to hang zombies from a tree and they're starting to shoot them. And Barbara sits like with her, I can't remember the word right now. Bandolier?
Bandolier. Mm-hmm.
Bandolier. Yeah, she's got a big old bandolier. She's got like this big old rifle. And she's staring at the mob and the zombies, and she's like, they're us and we're them. Because it's the question of like who actually has humanity at that moment in time.
Yeah.
And so I think that particularly the zombie movies, like Romero zombie movies, really explore what is humanity at this point in time, and what is it that robs us of our humanity. So, you know, racism robs us of our humanity. Capitalism, creating us to be cogs in the capitalist machine, robs us of our humanity. The military complex that creates us to be targets robs us of our humanity. So it's looking at what is it that robs us of our humanity, where the zombies are walking around actually living fuller lives than we are.
Right. And I do want to kind of revisit Matt's first part of his question in terms of zombie origins, if you will, because from my understanding, it didn't really come about until maybe the 19th century, where people were actually talking about it or became popularized, and it was associated with voodoo. However, it was more or less a part of the Haitian Creole folklore.
Yeah.
Where zombies, the reanimation of the body, but reanimation of the body without the soul, so that whoever conjures this entity has complete control over them. So, of course, you know, during enslavement and slave trades, the idea of being able to reanimate something or someone to cast vengeance upon an evil master or something to that effect, a lot of those stories began to adopt and evolve. And of course, you know, when something leaves and becomes contextualized in another space, it just takes on a different life. And of course, you know, now we have American zombieism, and I'm sure it looks a lot different from some of the origin stories of zombies on the island of Haiti. So I would love to explore that a little further as well. But that's kind of like my basic understanding of the actual some of the origins and the folklore
Like,
aspect of
yeah, and it's like, I wish I had, so I've actually like, I've written about this as well, and have like taught classes on kind of like the pop culture aspect of zombies. And so it's like, I wish I had revisited my notes, because like I have all my class notes that like actually, yeah. So I actually do, like I did, oh God, I sound like Tom Cruise. Don't be so glib, Matt Lauer. I did the research. But
You
like
I know.
but like kind of like introducing kind of like the framework of the historical context and how that moved us into like what we're seeing today in like The Walking Dead. Because I think it's like, I think zombies have become so, there was a time where it's like, you know, the Romero movies couldn't even get play in a theater, because they were also not rated. And so if you didn't have a rating to your movie, or if you had an X rating to your movie, you couldn't get play in a mainstream movie theater. Or if you did get play, you got play at like, you know, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night, or 1 o'clock in the morning. And now like, so like, I'm really not well versed in the television show, The Walking Dead. So like my forte is actually more in the graphic novel, but kind of like what I have seen in The Walking Dead, like,
And,
oh,
you know, and we are not in this conversation because, you know, we are all PhD'd in every single genre of zombie movies. I mean, this is conversation just about how these things intersect in ways in which we can explore it theologically. And so I know Will had a comment or question as well.
Yeah, just when you were talking to him, like I don't know, I never made the connection, but in terms of his trilogy of going from night to dawn to day, that things get brighter as this light being shined on this genre, but also this kind of apocalyptic genre. For me, I don't know, I'm a little slow sometimes, but it connected. I was like, yeah, the going from night, dawn to day is pretty awesome. And we share similar stories in terms of our love for that movie, and probably seen it when we were way too young, and then, you know, what is going on, and having zombie nightmares for the rest of my life, but then having this love relationship with the genre because of what it is. But I think, you know, in this day and age and context of where we are, we bring up apocalypse a lot. You know, are we in the apocalypse? And that meme of someone
we
like
always
on their
have
knees,
it.
kind of looking out, going, which day of Revelation are we yet? You know, I like that meme, but it's kind of like, but it's also, I wanted to tell my congregation that when I use the word apocalypse, I'm not just saying that we're being invaded by zombies or robots or aliens, but there is an unveiling that is going on before us that helps us go deeper into asking, what does it mean to be human? What do we value most? When okay, I'm gonna use, you know, it's PG-13. When the shit hits the fan, what are we gonna grab first? Is it gonna be our possessions? Is it gonna be our family? Is it gonna what are those what pictures are we grabbing off the wall that we care about the most? So that's what really this genre does. And so in this intersection of theology, faith, the apocalyptic genre or zombie genre, it's really lifting up for us and shining a light on unveiling what does it mean to be human? What do we value most? And so being in that time, so I think this genre can help with that, whether you love horror or not. I think that I was a big Walking Dead fan in terms of love the graphic novel, the show. You know, there's a whole nother episode we can talk about the show and where it went. But what was the context when you first taught this? You know, where did you teach this class, and what was the need of people calling for it for you that helped people go deeper into asking that question of what does it mean to be human? What do we value most? What humans do we value? That kind of thing.
So I taught this kind of like at the height of like The Walking Dead popularity. Also, I don't own a television anymore, so I don't know if it's still popular.
Kind of is. Yeah.
On Netflix.
Okay. So I started teaching it when people were really starting to engage with The Walking Dead on AMC.
Right.
Which at one point used to be American Movie Classics, but that's another story for another time. And it was actually my first ordained call into ministry. So I was responsible for teaching like an adult forum, and I was really at a loss for what to teach. And so I had gone to the pastor that I worked with, who had been at the parish for like 30 some odd years. And I was like, can I teach a class on theology and zombies? And he's like, you got to answer to council, not to me.
Council permission.
Right. So I went ahead and taught it, but it was really interesting because then like the high schoolers are like, we want to be in Pastor Tuhina's class. Can we, instead of doing youth group, actually sit in Pastor Tuhina's classes tonight? Because I also had to have like the classes rated. Because I did have a clip from Shaun of the Dead where Shaun did drop the F-bomb.
I love Shaun of the Dead.
Oh, so good.
Hilarious.
And so it actually came from actually an adult ed night of wanting to just kind of like introduce this because people were so engaged with The Walking Dead. And so it's kind of like, what's happening out in the world can actually inform what's happening like in our own bones and in our own incarnational identities and in our own theologies. So why don't we actually like talk about theology, and why don't we actually talk about pop culture? Like, because these two, if theology is supposed to be in the world and of the world, then there's so much that we can actually like really engage with in our theology out in the world. And so for me, it was kind of like an introduction to bring pop culture into the fellowship hall. And so like there was like one 87-year-old member, and she's like, Pastor, I love you and I support you, but I do not know what you're talking about.
That's okay.
Yeah.
It's like, that's okay.
But then there were parishioners who were kind of like in their 40s and 50s, like, yeah, we remember Night of the Living Dead when it came out. We remember Dawn. We remember Day. And, we actually had to like, go to like National Video and rent these and hide them from our parents because we wanted to watch them. And then like interacting with the high school students who were like, Pastor Tuhina, this is so cool and I can't wait to like tell my friends about it. I was like, whoa, yes.
Yeah.
But I also kind of like coming at it as a Lutheran theologian, because a lot of how I experience theology is through in corvatus in se. And so for me, that's actually the core of what goes wrong in the midst of the zombie apocalypse. So I also really, really, really love Max Brooks's World War Z. Yeah, so like the movie and the book, it's like a Venn diagram, and the only thing in common are the titles. But the book, like Max Brooks actually intently researched this book, like spoke to officials at the UN, like talked to people like in the pharmaceutical industry to really look at like how would a zombie apocalypse impact religion? How would it impact like a global worldwide response within the WHO? How would it impact a militarized response? How would it impact a response from the United Nations? How would it impact a response through like trade and industry? And so thinking about Max Brooks's World War Z and like taking like this really kind of, he really took it from a globalized view. And that you can see the breakdown happens when people start looking out for themselves. And there's glimpses early on in the book, like there's a community that's like built on stilts, and everybody had to be invested in one another's health and safety. And so like these were the small success stories when you actually like viewed your neighbor as in the image of God, as, worthy and whole and like, worthy to be granted the life that God has like fully granted and blessed upon them. That it's not just for you, that it's for everybody around you. And so this actually happens in the Walking Dead graphic novel. And actually, this is actually why I showed a clip of Shaun of the Dead. So like Shaun of the Dead, like it totally like just continues to deteriorate. And I think like one of the best scenes in Shaun of the Dead is like, after Shaun and Ed were, had a hard night of drinking after Shaun broke up with Liz, like Shaun like is in this hungover state and walks over to the corner store to buy a cornetto and to buy some sodas, and just totally oblivious of like all of the zombies walking around.
In the background.
Like the bloody handprint, like on the glass freezer door. Like,
but isn't that kind of like us right now? I mean, as you were just talking about
It
zombieism.
really
And to me,
is.
it's like the manifestation of a pandemic and how it impacts different aspects of our systems on a global level. And, some of us are kind of wandering around still, trying to figure out what's going on and ignoring the bloody handprint, ignoring the zombies walking in the background. So, I mean, that's just kind of how, some of us can be a little blind toward what the viruses are, who the viruses are, and things like that.
Right. Like, what actually is the virus? Like, what actually is out to what actually is out to end the sanctity of human life?
Well, Tahina, what I want to do also, if we can, I want to extend this zombie conversation into a broader topic of apocalyptic literature. I know sometimes we use apocalyptic literature synonymously with end times or eschatological literature, but what the apocalypse really is the uncovering or unveiling or revelation. In some of the apocryphal books in the Bible, you see the apocalypse of Moses, the apocalypse of Adam and Eve. There are all these revelations of things that are yet to be. So I'm curious, and this will be a question for everyone, I guess, like a little lightning round, because I don't want to prolong our time together. But if there are any books or films or graphic novels that speak to you in regard to apocalyptic literature that might have been one or two of the most impactful aspects of literature or film that you've encountered that really kind of shapes you.
So I think about, like, for me, like anything that's apocryphal is the lifting or the rending of the veil. And so for me, that actually goes to the end of Mark's gospel, where the veil is torn in two, when at Jesus's crucifixion and Jesus's death. And so for me, that's the revelation. That's like the unveiling of who Jesus truly is. And so for me, like, looking at what is unveiling, I think apocryphas are actually, like, I think they're terrifying and they're beautiful, to be entirely honest. I think it's a revelation of, like, who we can be. And so for me, I think, like, I'm rereading Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds by Adrienne Marie Brown. And so for me, that's actually a really apocryphal book, because it shows me how we can be as neighbor to one another. It shows me that, like, we can actually be invested in the alternative worlds that we want to create, in the multiverses that we want to live in. And so it's really thinking about, like, okay, then how do I take this apocalypse, and how do I work with others to create those multiverses in which we can exist wholly and fully as God created us? So definitely Emergent Strategy is, like, my go-to when it comes to apocryphal literature. And oddly, The Stand, Stephen King's The Stand, for me.
Yeah.
Because, like, I can talk about that too. I mean, the first time I saw Night of the Living Dead, I was 6 years old, and it was on PBS, and I was so scared that I had to sleep in my mom and dad's bed for, like, a month. And then my parents were like, this is really weird. So they took me to a child psychologist, and the child psychologist is like, what's wrong? I'm like, Night of the Living Dead. And they're like, oh, okay. And that just kind of solved the problem. It's just also fascinating because, like, my parents actually could have just asked me. But I also think, like, The Stand, I really got into it when I was in high school, when the miniseries on ABC came out, and it scared me the reality of it scared me to death, of thinking about, like, if I died, like, what would I value? Like, what would define, like, the relationships and who I am? But I think, like, for me, what was apocryphal was the end. Thinking about, like, really truly the hand of God coming down, like, in Las Vegas of all places. And kind of, like, I think, like, there really is kind of, like, I think about powers and principalities especially a lot in these days. And I think The Stand for me was actually really thinking a lot of, like, what are the systems that are in place that really, like, foster powers and principalities? Like, who is the Randall flag?
I love that.
You mentioned Octavia Butler and the Parable series. Like, I just went through Parable sower. Now I'm in the talents, and yeah, and reading it now in our present context. I know I'm a little bit late to the game with Butler herself and her work, but like towards the end of that book, like I was having a mild panic attack as I was reading it, and that's what it's supposed to do, because it evokes like a reality of what could happen. And not only that it's set in the 2020s, and we're now in the 2020s, but like in terms of her even creating a whole new kind of theology, religion behind what she's observing around her, that something's being revealed to her. I guess that itself makes it, apocalyptic, and she's experiencing that in terms of, and we are in the same context. So anymore, like part of your syllabus in those books too, how do you incorporate kind of that, or that book or that work or some of her work or graphic novels?
Okay,
Yeah.
so I'll go. So as full on revelation, I have to go with full on revelation, and mine would have to be the before there was Left Behind, there was the 1986 classic A Thief in the Night. Did anyone ever see this movie? Right? And it rocked me I was a high school sophomore or something. We did it in youth group. We watched it in youth group. Changed my life so much that as a joke a couple of years ago, my sister found it on VHS and brought it back to my life, and I had a visceral reaction to it. And that, I mean, aside from the fact that I think there's some, Matt, you've seen it. Tell me if there's music in it that I swear is part of Holy Grail. That's like the same music, but that's a whole nother thing. But if you haven't seen this will change you. And yes, it's dated. Yes, it's a full-on 1986 church movie. It's exactly what you expect. But the opening scene, and this is no spoiler, I mean, the opening scene is everyone's going on with their life, and the one that I was even referencing this last week, no joke, that a mom is cooking and sends a kid to next door to get some eggs because she ran out of eggs, and then you see scenes of somebody shaving and the wife and people on the highway, et cetera, and then all of a sudden in the very next scene there are eggs sizzling on the sidewalk, and a razor is by it's like going, but it's in its sink, and the wife comes in and is like, what is happening? And planes are going and crashes are happening, and it has happened in the blink of an eye. And boy, when you are 16 years old, that changes you when you start to understand how revelation. So that's my little contribution to our apocalyptic conversation. This one.
There's no time to change your mind. The sun has come and you've been left behind.
Yeah, that's in this. Have fun, y'all. Have fun. Nightmares. I feel you.
It sounds so awful. Brian, what about you?
Write us out.
Any particular literature or film or something that speaks to you?
Brian, do you want to talk about the rapture first, or then go to that?
No, I'm gonna not talk about the rapture.
Okay.
No, I will say that I'm always amazed at how the media treats apocalypse, right? Because the focus on that is always the disaster, right? It's the zombie apocalypse, or it's the post-apocalyptic view of the Hunger Games, or like there's been some disaster, or they're in the middle of some disaster, and that is a complete reduction of that. So I was really pleased when I watched Good Omens on Amazon, that it is. I really feel like it's the best of apocalypse, because there is the disaster, but right, I will hold that the notion of apocalypse is something that's meant to give hope to folks who are in the midst of truly troubling and disaster-filled times. Um, so, Good Omens ends on a really lovely hope, and it is something also that throughout a lot of the series, that it is at least it is unclear who the good guy or the bad guy is, and I mean that even with respect to God. And I think in the end, there's still a pretty positive look, which is surprising given the writers, where it comes out of. So, but that's one that just recently that has been out there that folks can still watch. I think has a true apocalyptic imagination, and I think that's the important part, is the imagination. Like in all of those, like the Night of the Living Dead, the Living Dead movies, that there's a community, right? And what's the imagination that the apocalypse brings about, right? You see the same thing also brought up Walking Dead, right? Multiple communities that react differently. And is it a tyrannical, despotic community, or is it something that is more life-giving? So, but anyway, I'll go with Good Omens.
And David Tennant and Michael Sheen. So there we go.
They are awesome.
David Tennant can get me through anything. Just saying. Goodbye.
And I want to acknowledge Brian for that that apocalypse, that divine revelation of a thing, and acknowledging the hope. I do feel like the secularization of apocalyptic in sacred text does kind of take on that end time destruction, Armageddon, Babylon type of feel. But how does it also simply reveal who we were, who we are, and how we can potentially change our course so that we don't end up self-destructing, destroying ourselves.
Right.
And so there is a hope in that divine revelation. That's so powerful, and thank you for highlighting that. Even with zombieism, we're starting to see like a different take on zombie films. I watched recently The Girl with All the Gifts, where these children are zombie-like. It's labeled post-apocalyptic, but films now have zombies with intelligence. I watched iZombie, so now you can be zombified.
Right. Warm Bodies.
Warm Bodies. Yeah, I was going to bring up Warm Bodies too. Yeah.
Right?
Santa Clarita Diet.
Oh, yes.
Oh my gosh.
Yes. So there's all this like, are they undead? Are they living dead? How are they living if they're dead? What does resurrection, what does all of that look like now in modernity, as we are watching zombies evolve with intelligence? And so, I mean, it just kind of takes on that whole other aspect of humanizing, because in The Girl with All the Gifts, they looked at it as a virus, as opposed to this, otherworldly thing. It's like, no, this was created. It can be passed down as long as you teach them and educate people, or these, I forgot what they call them in the movies, they can learn and they can understand. So it was really interesting. But so in keeping that in mind, I would say maybe The Shack is kind of like my apocalyptic go-to, the revelations of God in various forms, and the prophetic witness of how, in the context of one suffering, how the holy is still present. And that movie was just so evocative. It's in the book was evocative as well. I mean, it's based on a father whose child is kidnapped, believed to be dead. All that was left of her, they found a red hoodie or something like that in the woods. So he goes to the place where this hoodie was found, where she was believed to have been murdered. So he's taken into these other realms to bring resolve, to grieve. And God is revealed in various forms and races and genders and identities. And it's just this magnificent unveiling of sorts of our own humanity, as we talked about, as well as the unveiling of our understanding, or lack thereof, of God. So So yeah, so I wasn't sure if anyone else wanted to chime in on their.
Well, I think, and then building off your shack, like God shows up, the triune God shows up, but in different ways than he ever imagined, to try to help him. It subverts his expectations in a way that helps get to the core of his pain and suffering. And so building off kind of what you said, Shana, and also Brian, in terms of that imagination, building off the imagination, that's kind of what we do at TheoCon. That's what Brian does with his podcast, Church of the Geek. Hina Pastor, what she does in her classes in church, and kind of what I've done here with a kind of a Godless Geeks book club, is that using the literature and the geeky things that we get into for entertainment, also that are asking the big questions, to help us go deeper into our imaginations of asking the big questions together of who we understand God to be, and who we understand ourselves to be, and who we understand our neighbors to be. And a lot of times that holds up the mirror and makes us uncomfortable, because we look in the mirror and like, am I a zombie just consuming? How do I view my neighbor? Or what am I really living for? What do I value? It's pretty big. But what I guess what we're trying to do with this too is give people permission to go deeper within the pop culture that they're into, to ask those questions. They have permission to do that, and get creative. Let your imagination roll. Yeah, even if it scares you a little bit, go there.
Oh, thank you for that. I mean, yeah, are we Frankenstein, or are we thy Adam? You know, or whatever Frankenstein's monster's name was, Ed. I don't remember. But Matt, did you want to chime in before we
Yeah,
go
sure.
connections?
Apocalyptic stuff was really important to me for my early spiritual formation, because my dad was raised on various fundamental premillennial dispensational rapture theories. In fact, I have a bunch of stuff in his. I'm staying with him because he broke his shoulder right now. So I could go up to my old room where he stores all these old books of, like, I have charts. All right. I have end times charts, as well as various documents that keep guessing wrong who the Antichrist is. But I think one of the most freeing things for me about Revelation itself was when I started going to a church that was amillennial, and the pastor, like, I had never, you sit around and you're taught this stuff, and then you think, is this how the people who would have read this or written this really understood this stuff? Like, is this locust a helicopter? Is it? I'm not sure if it is. And I had a pastor who was preaching on Revelation one time at a different church I was going to, and he was like, the revelation of Middle East oil intrigue. Nope, you got to read it again, because it's the revelation of Jesus Christ. And that, and I think, to Brian's comment, seeing apocalypse as an unveiling of hope, I think that was really important. And it makes me think about how in pop culture, there's this whole conversation surrounding the character of Superman, and whether or not you can make a good Superman movie, whether or not he's a worthy character to make a movie of, because hope isn't seen as sexy. Despair and angst and deconstruction and nihilism are. And so I've really enjoyed recently reading recently I was reading Deceased by Tom Taylor, which is a DC zombies book. And even though, spoiler alert, Superman ends up getting overtaken, he still is this hopeful, like, Batman doesn't take center stage, Superman takes center stage, and it's awesome. And he's able to be this inspirational symbol of hope, whose legacy lives on through his son. Reading the recent Doomsday Clock, which was the Watchmen sequel, like, it ends with this sort of potential nuclear annihilatory situation. But Superman acts as this symbol of hope, rather than being this turned into this mopey, despairing person. And I think it's very well written. Same thing with All-Star Superman. If you're going to write a story about Superman dying and, of sun cancer, what kind of story are you going to write? And it ends up ending on a hopeful note. So yeah, I think apocalypse can be hopeful. It doesn't have to be Thief in the Night scary. And I think in our pop culture, we can build an imagination that emphasizes hope, rather than having to end in this sort of like constant pit of despair, which in some ways I guess is easier and more inevitable, because as Tahina has pointed out, like, there's no health in us. There's this inward turning of our heart on itself that sabotages everything we do, which is something Apocalypse can show us as well. But I think hope can be very underrated.
Sure. Thank you for that. And thank you for acknowledging the both and, as Tahina had mentioned as well. It's like, it holds a mirror up to ourselves. And I know some people are like Easter people. They just want the victory and the resurrection and fun, but they don't want to go through Good Friday and the crucifixion. That's the hard work. So how does the Apocalypse embody both and I love that you just lifted up. Like, you don't really talk about hope when it comes to the Apocalypse. So thank you, Matt, for the observation. Our time is running out. I know we can probably chill and pick it all day long, but I do want to give the final words to our guests in terms of our TheoCon connections. Excuse me, no, I messed that up, Missy. Theo connections. I'm new at this, okay? Theo connections.
Theo conversations.
Well, we're in Theo Conversations, but now we're shifting into Theo Connections, where this is the opportunity to kind of put a little plug in about what you're doing, if you have any events, published works that you would like us to look out for, and then we'll have a little plug about TheoCon, and we'll wrap it up.
Gosh, I mean, like, it's really weird in this time of COVID because this is the longest I've been home since 2017. And because, like, I was supposed to be at a conference next month, I'm supposed to be part of Nevertheless She Preached, and I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but if it does happen, I should be there. And just kind of like, yeah, I'm just plugging and chugging. I tweet more than I should. Follow me on Twitter.
What is the best way for people to contact you? Any tags that we should follow? What would you like to
So Facebook, Insta, and Twitter are all at TVRASCHE. Like, I'm just kind of easy to find.
Excellent.
We'll make sure that's in the notes down below our video here. So
Cool. Thank you.
Awesome. And we'll continue to do our TheoCon Thursdays. That's what this segment is a part of, on third Thursdays. And we will have to figure out the time we're going to premiere it. And we're still, even though our September 19th event is postponed, it is not delayed. We will still be doing some type of special symposium or something around that time where we will continue to collect our geeks from across the world. So, TheoCon, where theology meets pop culture. Visit us on our website at theocon.live. Follow us on Facebook or Insta or Twitter at TheoCon Live.